It's just about time for us to get started, but as you can see, I'm not halfway back this morning, so if you do want to move forward, you can. If you don't, that's fine, but I'll have something up here on the screen in a second, so it might be easier to see. It is good to see everyone this morning. I'm glad we can be here to continue our studies together, to continue looking at some aspects of one of the most difficult books of Scripture in some ways, but also one of the most relevant books of Scripture. I'll ask that as I'm working with this thing, that you bear with me, because obviously I haven't done this in a while, so but I think it'll be good, and I think it'll be really helpful, especially as we're doing this study this morning. But let's go ahead as we get started and have a prayer, and then we'll get into our class. Would you bow with me, please? Our Father God in heaven, Lord, we come before you so grateful for everything you have done for us. Father, you have blessed us far beyond measure in so many different ways, and we have no one but you to thank. Father, even those things that we have worked hard to accomplish, that we have contributed to in some way, Father, you have given us the very abilities that we have contributed to those things, and we just ask that we never take our blessings for granted, but always remember that you have given them to us to use as stewards of your will and of all that you have given to us. Father, we are mindful of those who are sick at this time, who are suffering in other ways, Father, who are down perhaps or discouraged, who are struggling to follow you in the way that you want them to. Father, we just pray that you would comfort them and help us to look for opportunities to help them as well. Father, we ask that you would just be with us as we're striving to serve you in everything that we do. Lord, we ask that you bless our study this morning, that you help us to gain from the study of one of the books in your word, Father, and just help us to recognize what you intend for us to learn and be able to apply this as we go about our lives and as we interact with the world around us as your people. Father, we ask all these things in the name of Jesus Christ, your Son. Amen. All right, so we are finally looking specifically at the book of Revelation. The last 2 or 3 weeks, we've been looking at adjacent things, if you will, preparing for this study, looking at apocalyptic literature and different things like that. But this morning we are going to start in specifically on Revelation. We're not getting into the text yet. I know you're like, wait, we keep on building up and building up. We're not there yet. We cannot understand, I think this is a fair statement, we cannot understand the text if we don't get into some very specific background to the book first. So we're probably going to spend at least the next couple of weeks looking at the background because ultimately that is crucial to this entire effort to understand the book of Revelation. I'm going to set my Bible aside. I'll probably pick it up here in a second just to look at a couple things, not because we're not looking at something related to the book, but just because we're going to look at some history that ties into the book that is very, very necessary for us to understand what John, through the Holy Spirit, is trying to communicate. And I know I'm standing up here. This is still class. I'm still going to be asking questions and asking for comments, so please be ready for that as well. So as we're looking at this, I keep wanting to look back here. I can see it right here. The book, if we read verse 1, or the first couple of verses anyway, the book is written to the churches in Asia. John is addressing this book to the churches in Asia. Now, when we think of Asia, where do we usually think of? Do what? Okay, China, Japan, maybe Russia, or at least most of Russia, right? We don't think of anywhere around the Mediterranean. But in this time period, Asia did not refer to Japan and China because they didn't know about Japan and China. They barely knew about places like India. That was like the far reaches of the world. They don't have this concept of the 7 continents or anything like that. I mean, there's a reason why it's called the New World. I wonder why that's doing that. So, because of that, we have to understand when he says the churches in Asia, he's talking about this little area right here. It's not just a region, in fact. This is a Roman province. I've outlined a helpful tool has outlined for me several of the Roman provinces in what is now considered the country of Turkey. Anatolia is a name that it was given later on after Christ and everything. But you have Bithynia and Galatia and Cappadocia, all of which, by the way, are mentioned in the text of Scripture, and we'll see that in a second. But this left half, if you will, this western half, that is the province of Asia. The churches in Asia, that province, are where John is writing to. And of course, if you kind of want to orient, this would be Jerusalem down here. We have Egypt, Greece, and Rome would be over here, this Mediterranean Sea. That's where we have the letter of Revelation, or the book of Revelation. The beginning of it's in a letter form, and all of it's addressed to Asia, the churches in Asia. That's the region where John is writing to. He says, I want the churches in Asia to get this message. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that other Christians throughout the centuries wouldn't be intended to have this as well, but just like the letter to the Galatians, the letter to the Ephesians, the letter to the Colossians, all of those are written to specific groups of people in a specific area. I want us to understand this is where Revelation is written to. It's going to be very important for us as we move through this study. So, John to the 7 churches of Asia specifically. You can see, hopefully, these 7 cities right here. We zoom in on this province of Asia, and there's these 7 cities. And all these cities, they're kind of in order. If you look in chapters 2 and 3, which we'll do in a few weeks, he's writing to these 7 churches, and he names them in order like you would travel through these cities. You would generally land at the port city of Ephesus, you travel up to Smyrna, up to Pergamum, and then back down once you get past the mountains through Thyatira, Smyrna, Philadelphia, or rather Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. And so this is the region that we're talking about. These are the churches that we're talking about. And we need to understand, before we get into the text of the book, why is he writing to these churches? What's unique about their situation that's different from everyone else? Because a lot of times when we read Revelation, we kind of skip over that. At least in my experience. A lot of times we skip over the fact that he's specifically writing to these churches here, and we end up just kind of thinking, oh, this is written to the church as a whole. And again, it is in a sense, just like Galatians and Ephesians and all those, ultimately are intended for the church as a whole, but they're written specifically to a group of congregations for a specific purpose. And if we don't get that purpose, we're not going to get the book. So as we're looking at this, I want us to notice, trying to kind of piece together, why Asia? You can see up here, again, I'm not intending for us to be able to see all the cities and stuff, like here's Ephesus, and there's Thessalonica and Corinth. We don't have to see all the different cities, but this is a map of Paul's 3 missionary journeys. I don't have the journey to Rome up there. It's a little bit of a different situation, but the 3 missionary journeys, as we call them, this is the map of that. Why is this important? Well, we see him generally, if you follow the kind of the arrows, he starts from down here around Jerusalem and so forth, usually each time. And for at least the second and third missions, he ends up over here in Greece and over in Corinth and Thessalonica, Philippi. And, of course, we're familiar with the letter of the Philippians, for example. But beyond those 2, notice what's dead center of all of those. Asia. And the territory immediately surrounding the province of Asia. Paul spends a lot of time in Asia, which means there are a lot of Christians in Asia. Now, I want us to kind of unpack that for just a second before we move on. Why would Paul spend so much time in the Roman province of Asia, as well as the adjacent provinces of Galatia, Cappadocia, and so forth? Why would he spend so much time in that part of the world? Okay, he's supposed to teach the Gentiles. You're exactly right. That's not in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria. Why is that the natural place to start teaching the Gentiles? Remember, he starts with Asia. That's his first missionary journey, pretty much, is right in this area right here. That's where he goes for his first missionary journey, and he keeps on going further and further into Gentile territory, eventually making it to Greece. Later on, he'll be able to teach in Rome. He wanted to go to Spain, we're told. We're not exactly sure. The scriptures don't tell us if he ever made it to Spain, but he wanted to at least. But why is Asia the first place, the natural next step as he begins to teach the Gentiles?
Ephesus is kind of a central place like Jerusalem.
Okay, very good. Ephesus, as we said right here, that is one of the major port cities connecting a lot of the general area, so that would be a very efficient way for him to use his time to be in an area that's connected with all these other areas. What else? What else might be the case? We talked a lot when we looked through the book of Acts, right, about how Paul conducted himself each time he went to a new place. Where would he go first? Anytime he enters a new city, where does Paul go first?
Synagogue.
The synagogue. Why?
That's where the Jews were.
Okay, that's where the Jews were. But Andy said, and he's correct, that Paul is the apostle of the Gentiles. So why is Paul so concerned about the Jews?
Like the religious people are.
Okay, not only do you have the Jews in the synagogue, you would also have proselytes who are Gentile by birth. And you also sometimes just have Gentiles who are interested in learning about this new God and all these kinds of things. That's where he starts. And then, as we see throughout the book of Acts, he'll start in the synagogue in the city, and then he'll begin kind of expanding his efforts throughout the city, even beyond the Jewish individuals there and so forth. And he'll eventually, in some cities at least, abandon the synagogue altogether when the Jews reject him, and go to somewhere where the Gentiles specifically are going to be able to hear the gospel. Maybe there aren't even any Jews there at that point. But he always starts with the Jews because they have the same background. They have the same type of understanding of God as a single God rather than polytheism, which is just many gods, pagan religion. So, if Paul's method of teaching the Gentiles is to go to a city, start with the Jews in the city, and expand from there to the Gentiles, guess where in the Roman Empire you have the second biggest population of Jews, second only to Jerusalem, Judea, that area itself? It's Asia. The province of Asia, that whole area, has the largest population of Jews throughout the Roman Empire, other than, of course, Judea itself. So there's a reason why Paul spends so much time here in Asia. It's because he is going to a place where he can kind of have a foundation, even as he's going to Gentiles. And as he expands from there, we see him going to Greece and so forth. Even from there, he's using places, like Andy mentioned, like Ephesus, as kind of a springboard to be able to launch his missionary efforts into these other places. So what's the point? The point is, by the time John writes Revelation, Christianity is very strongly established in the province of Asia. That's going to be relevant as we move forward. It's not the only relevant piece of information we're going to look at, but that's going to be extremely relevant. The church has been firmly established. A lot of the Christians in this area are of Jewish descent. A lot are also Gentiles. And what else happened, primarily in Asia, although also elsewhere, what else happened to Paul while he was working in Asia? We alluded to it a second ago. What else do you see happening to Paul while he's in Asia, while he's teaching and establishing churches?
The riots and so forth.
You have multiple times riots or attempts to attack Paul or to throw him out of the city, stone him. I believe that also happened in Asia, if I remember correctly. What did all of those events have in common? All but maybe one. They were started by Jews. They were started by Jews who opposed the gospel message. So not only do you have him going to these places because Jews are going to potentially, hopefully, be more receptive to the gospel, but as it turns out, you also have these areas of Asia and these surrounding areas. Those are some of the most, where you have some of the most, I guess, not even necessarily violent, but strongest centers of persecution against Christians at this point in time. You're probably thinking as we're going through this, we already finished the book of Acts. Why are we talking about all this? What does this have to do with Revelation? Let's just keep this in the back of our minds. We're getting there. So, we need to talk about when this book is written. What you see back here is a depiction, an artist's depiction of the siege of Jerusalem. That happened in 70 AD, so about 7 decades, give or take, after the birth of Christ. So maybe, what are we looking at? About 4 decades after the church is established. Spoiler alert, if we haven't mentioned this already, I think we've mentioned this before in class, but the dating of Jesus' birth is probably not exactly 0 AD because the AD BC system was set up many, many years later, and they got it a little bit off, most likely. So anyway, that's neither here nor there. The point is, just a few decades after the church is established, as Jesus himself prophesies, Jerusalem is destroyed by the Romans. This is relevant for us when we talk about when it's written, because there are really 2 ideas as to when this book, Revelation, was written. The first one is that it was written just before this destruction, the destruction of Jerusalem. And it's written according to this idea. It's written kind of as a warning of what's about to happen. Make sure Christians understand Rome is the bad guy, all these kinds of things. It's kind of got this end of the world type feeling because the age of Judaism is over and all of this stuff is happening. And of course, Christians, because a lot of times the pagans saw Jews and Christians being similar, they would oftentimes associate the two, and so Christians would sometimes face some of the same persecution that the Jews who revolted would face that led to this destruction of Jerusalem. Again, in all of this, we're not trying to go crazy deep into history, but we have to get our minds around a general sense of what we're talking about here. There's a couple of reasons why people have concluded that this was written around this time in the 60s AD, right before the destruction of Jerusalem. Again, this would certainly fit the depiction of Rome as a villain and all these kinds of things, as we're even going to see as we get into the text. And also, this would feel, from a Jewish perspective, again, a lot of the Christians in Asia are Jewish, this would kind of feel like the end of the world, right? Jerusalem is their city. The temple is there. All this is going to kind of feel like the end of the world. And so that also would fit with the tone of the book. And so there are some people, even still today, who hold to this date that it was written or just before the destruction of Jerusalem, kind of describing that and warning of that. But ultimately, aside from those kind of coincidental pieces of evidence, when we really look at the evidence, both inside the book and outside the book, this date just doesn't work. Even most people who used to hold this date have since abandoned it because it doesn't fit the evidence that we're given. Of course, when we read a book, when we read an epistle of Paul, when we read one of the Gospels, do they ever tell us when the book was written? They might say in the days of this king or something like that, but they don't give us a date. Why not? Well, again, the AD BC dating system wasn't even invented until hundreds of years later. They're not going to tell us the date, so we have to figure out when this is written. Again, I know this feels like a lot of history, but we have to be able to wrap our minds around this in order to appreciate what we're going to look at in the book itself. So let's look at the other date. This, by the way, is a picture of a temple, specifically a temple that is erected to be used for the worship of some of the emperors of Rome. This particular one is actually in France, not in Asia, but it is a good depiction of what this kind of temple would look like. And we'll get more into that in a second, but I just want to give you a background on the pictures. But when was the book written? If it's not written in the 60s, the other option, and most people believe that this is correct, I believe this is correct, and there's reasons why that we're going to look at. Most people believe this was written right at the end of the first century. This would have been written in the 90s AD. So this would be, 6 decades or so after the church was established. We're right at the tail end of the first century. This is, as we know from several different sources, this is John, of course, writing. That's not what we know from the sources. He identifies himself. But in terms of John's kind of situation at this point, John's the last living apostle. We're told at the beginning of the book he's in exile and all these kinds of things. This all would fit very well with this situation that we're given here. And so we have this idea of it being written in the 90s, and the last part of this, and key point in all of this, if that's the case, if it was written in the 90s, it would have been written during the time of a certain emperor, Emperor Domitian. It's going to become really important if this date is true. But I want us for a little bit to talk about why it would have been written at this point in time, because I imagine some of y'all probably have heard evidence for the other date. And so I just want us to be clear on why the evidence does point to it being written at this time in history. So, first of all, John wrote other books, right? What other books did John write? Okay, John wrote John. What else? Do what? Okay, he wrote 4 other books, 3 letters and a gospel, right? Even if we don't talk about when Revelation was written, we can establish pretty well, in fact, I would say even better than Revelation, just independently, we can establish pretty well that those other 4 books were all written around the same time. Now, if we want to talk about, which one was written first, we can talk about that. That's not really relevant to our discussion here. Those 4 books were also written in the 90s. Kind of stands to reason he would write this one in the 90s, right? He wrote those, by the way, to the church, addressing several key problems, some of which are going to show up, at least in some way, as what do you call it? He's going to kind of allude to and going to kind of refer to him without going into too much detail in Revelation itself. But these other 4 books, they're very clearly written during this time period, at the end of the 1st century, when the church is a little more established, when the Jewish opposition is a little bit different, because ultimately Jerusalem has already been destroyed by this time. And so that fits just by itself because John wrote all the other books at this time. But there's some other things too. Looking back here just so I can see it a little better. Early Christian writers, we're talking people just a few decades after the 90s, they also date this book to the end of the 1st century, not before the destruction of Jerusalem. We could go into all the details of who and everything. That's not going to be really helpful for us because I just want to give us a general idea. But if you've heard of, maybe sometimes they're called the early church fathers or something like that, there are Christians who wrote a lot of different books shortly after the time of the 1st century. And in a lot of those books, they refer to Revelation as being written at the end of the 1st century. So that's powerful evidence for us to kind of consider as we're moving through this. But not only that, there's a couple of internal pieces of evidence that are very helpful as well. You remember in Acts and in the book to the Ephesians, you remember how Paul describes the church in Ephesus? Whenever Paul talks about the church in Ephesus, both in his letter to them and as we see the description in Acts, how do we see Paul describing them? Is it positive or negative? Overall, it's very positive. Paul establishes the church in Ephesus, if we follow the timeline of Acts, fairly, kind of in the middle, if you will, of his career, I guess you could say, as a missionary. It would have been in the 50s, maybe early 60s, depending on the dating and stuff like that. They're described as a very strong church. They're described as a church that abounds in love. He describes them that way in his letter to them. Do we really think that just a handful of years later, they would be described as having lost their first love? It's possible, but highly unlikely, that they go from being such a loving church described by Paul and others to John describing them as having abandoned their first love to such a degree that they're at the risk of, as John describes it in Revelation, their candlestick being taken out of the lampstand. That doesn't really fit. Again, it's possible, but it doesn't really fit. It does fit, however, if you look in the book of Acts. Remember when Paul meets with the Ephesian elders on the beach and he is talking with them and saying, "This is the last time I'm getting to see you." Remember what he tells them? He gives them a warning. Anyone remember what that warning is? He's talking to the Ephesian elders. He says, before too long, in a little while, there are going to be savage wolves that come in among you, and they're going to try and destroy the flock. Given that timeline, and given how John describes Ephesus, it would fit perfectly for a couple, 3 decades to have passed. The church in Ephesus is there. After a few years, this false teaching comes in, and as a result of that false teaching, you have Ephesus responding in such a way that they end up in the position that we have them described in John, or in Revelation, by John, rather. Same thing with Laodicea in a different way. Anyone remember in Revelation 2 and 3, rather 3 actually, I know we haven't gotten there quite yet, but the 7 letters to the churches, anyone remember how Laodicea is described? Not spiritually, but how they're described just as people, as a society, if you will.
Are they lazy?
They're lazy in a sense, but not their character. I'm talking about their situation. Is the church in Laodicea struggling physically, or are they doing well? Remember, Laodicea is the ones that he says, we say we are rich, we are wealthy, we have all this going for us, right? And he says, spiritually, you are poor and naked and destitute. But the point we need to take from that is that from a physical standpoint, the church in Laodicea, the people in Laodicea, were very wealthy. Here's the problem. If Revelation was written before the destruction of Jerusalem in the 60s, historically we know Laodicea suffered a major earthquake right around the beginning of the 60s AD. And there's almost no possible way they would have had the time to rebuild and become a wealthy, affluent city in that short of a time. But again, we look at history and we realize they did invest a lot in rebuilding their city, and although it took several years, by the end of the first century, they were wealthy again. And in fact, they were very proud of the job they had done in rebuilding their city after the earthquake that had happened a few decades before. So this is also, I know we're getting a little bit into a lot of detail here, but this is also very strong evidence that this book was written in the 90s at the end of the first century. We also have one other thing that I want to make mention of, because we don't often talk about this. I want to sow the seeds for this now because we'll get into it when we get to the text. You remember several times in Revelation, if you've read through Revelation anytime recently, you remember this reference to Babylon falling, right? Babylon has fallen. An angel flies over at one point saying, Babylon the Great has fallen. Now, almost without question, and we're going to see why as we go in the text, that's a reference to the city of Rome, or maybe even more broadly to the Roman Empire. We don't really think twice about referring to Rome as Babylon. That's something that even sometimes in our culture, there's just this kind of connection between the two. Just in general, we kind of, oh yes, Babylon the Great, whatever. But I want us to think about this from the perspective of someone living during this time. Why was Babylon significant to Jews?
They were in prison there.
Okay, they were imprisoned there. Very good. The Babylonians had invaded Judah. They had taken them prisoner. What else had they done? This is back, centuries before Christ, right? Babylonians invade Judah. They took a bunch of Judeans prisoner. That's where you have Daniel, for example, being a captive in Babylon. What else had the Babylonians done during that invasion? Do what? You can say it.
They destroyed the temple.
They destroyed the temple. Again, we're looking back from so far removed, we might not connect this. But why would Rome be described as Babylon?
They destroyed Jerusalem.
It only makes sense to refer to Rome as Babylon if they have destroyed the temple. There's this connection. Remember, we talked last week, right, about Daniel being kind of one of the first apocalyptic books, and Revelation is kind of pulling from that style in a way that Christians would understand because they're familiar with the Old Testament. Daniel uses this. Daniel's set in Babylon. Daniel's talking about all these events that happened in connection with the destruction of Jerusalem. It would only make sense for John to describe Rome as Babylon if Rome has already destroyed the temple. So if you have Revelation being written before that destruction, and people are reading that, it's not going to make any sense. They're not going to know who in the world John's talking about because that hadn't happened yet. So all that being said, I want to go ahead and throw that out there. All that being said, the evidence, I would argue, is very, very clear. The book of Revelation is written at the end of the first century, around 90, 91, 92, somewhere in there, give or take. It's written to Christians by John, specifically the Christians in Asia, and it's written during the time of the Emperor Domitian. That's going to be really, really important. We're going to go ahead and introduce this next thing. We're not going to finish this morning, but we're going to go ahead and introduce this next thing because all of what we just said is going to be hugely important as we get into the text of the book itself. We need to actually talk about this guy. This is Emperor Domitian. He was emperor during this last part of the first century, and he would have been emperor during the writing of the book of Revelation. Why do we need to talk about him? Well, when we look at this, we talked about the destruction of Jerusalem, right? I'm going to throw a little more history out there. Stay with me. I know this seems like a lot, but this is crucial for us to understand. Why did the Jews revolt when they did that ultimately resulted in Rome destroying the temple in Jerusalem? We probably don't really think about why. We know they wanted freedom, right? They're in subjection to Rome. They want their freedom. But why did they pick that particular time in history? Well, it's because Rome was going through a civil war. In 69 AD, it's sometimes called the year of the four emperors, there was this civil war. Because Nero, the emperor at that time, he had died, but there's no clear successor. And so ultimately you have, essentially, to oversimplify it a lot, you have three politicians and a general, and you can maybe argue the other politicians also were generals in a sense, but let's just leave that there. You have four men, one of whom is a very powerful general, all claiming or fighting over the empireship, or emperorship. I don't even know how you say that, right? Fighting over who will be the next emperor. Well, what better time to stage a revolt against the most powerful empire in the world than if that empire is having a civil war and fighting amongst themselves? That was exactly what the Jews thought. So that's why they revolted when they did, that ultimately ended up with Jerusalem and the temple being destroyed. That's a side note, ultimately. What we need to understand is what effect that had on the future. You have this civil war, and ultimately, as might not be surprising, guess who won of those four people? It was the really powerful general who had a giant army behind him, right? His name, just to throw it out there again, we don't have to remember all these details, but his name was Vespasian. His son was Titus. Titus is actually the one who conquers Jerusalem and destroys the temple. And Titus's brother, Vespasian's other son, was Domitian. So the result of this civil war was that you have a completely new family take over control of being emperor, right? That's very important for us because a lot of times we don't understand what kind of effect something like that would have in Rome. For us today in America, right? We have a president, but how much power does the president actually have? I'm not asking for someone to cite the Constitution or anything like that, but in terms of other nations, other countries, other empires, how much power does our president actually have? Okay, it's supposed to be a balance of power. As, rules is written, right? Again, going back to our Constitution and so forth, the president certainly doesn't have unlimited power, certainly doesn't have ultimate power. It's essentially designed that there's this balance of power between the president, the houses of Congress, the judiciary. You don't have someone who is in complete control. A lot of times when we hear the word empire or the word emperor or the word king, we think of someone who is in complete control. And that's just such a foreign concept to us, right? I mean, our entire country was founded on the idea we don't want one man, King George or whatever, we don't want one man to be in control. We want this power to be distributed to where no one person can become a tyrant, right? And so we think about emperors like Emperor Domitian or Nero or Octavian or whoever. We think of these emperors and we're like, that's completely foreign. And in a sense, yes, it is. It is very true that the emperor ultimately held complete control in a practical sense. But here's what a lot of times we don't understand. And we're going to mention this. I want us to be kind of keeping this in mind, and we're going to go into more detail on this next time. Rome was a little bit more like us in terms of their politics than we sometimes realize. Yes, Rome had an emperor, and that emperor ultimately did have ultimate power in a practical sense. But Rome also had a senate. Rome also had a political class, if you will, a bunch of career politicians. And while, yes, the emperor was the guy, the senate and the politicians had a lot of input and a lot of influence. And if the emperor doesn't do what they like, it can cause a lot of problems. And so what you're going to see as we move into the specific situation when John writes Revelation is we're going to see that politics ultimately is going to create a hostile environment for the Jews in Asia specifically. And that's why John writes this book to who he does and the way that he does it. I hope, and as we move into next week as well, I hope we're not going too deep in the weeds in this. I'm not asking you to remember all this information. This isn't a history class, right? But I want us to get a big picture of what's happening around the churches that John's writing to. What do they see happening around them? Because unless we understand that, we're not going to really get what John is trying to emphasize to them from a spiritual perspective. Any comments or questions before we close for this morning? Please feel free to share with me later on if we're going too fast, if we need more explanation, more time, whatever. So I want us to get the big picture here. Thank you so much.